Hi, I'm Rosalind, and this past Christmas my daughter-in-law called me a useless burden, right in the middle of dinner at Bellacorte, the finest Italian restaurant in Millbrook. But what she didn't know was that I owned every brick, every table, and every bottle of wine she was drinking from. She thought she was humiliating me in front of strangers, but she was actually destroying her own family's future in the place I'd built from nothing over 30 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The whole nightmare started innocently enough. My son Garrett had been begging me for months to join them for Christmas dinner somewhere nice, instead of my usual home-cooked meal. "Come on, Mom," he'd say. "Let Priscilla and me treat you this year. You've done enough cooking for one lifetime." At 72, I suppose I should have been flattered that they wanted to take care of me. But something in Priscilla's tight smile whenever the topic came up made my stomach turn. Still, I agreed, thinking maybe this was their way of including me more in their lives, after feeling increasingly pushed aside since their wedding 2 years ago. Priscilla chose Bellacorte, of course. She always did love that restaurant, posting Instagram photos of herself there every few weeks, acting like she discovered some hidden gem. Little did she know that every time she tagged the location, every time she raved about the authentic atmosphere and exquisite service, she was promoting the business I'd poured my heart, soul, and savings into since I was 42 years old. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I'd kept my ownership quiet for reasons that would become painfully clear that Christmas evening. When we arrived that snowy December night, the hostess greeted me with the warm smile she always gave me, though she was professional enough not to let on that I was anything more than another customer. I'd trained my staff well over the years. Discretion was everything in this business. Priscilla, meanwhile, was already making a show of critiquing the decor as if she were some kind of interior design expert, loud enough for nearby tables to hear her opinions about the quaint but outdated vineyard murals I'd commissioned from a local artist 15 years earlier. The dinner started pleasantly enough. Garrett seemed genuinely happy to be treating his mother to a nice meal, and even Priscilla managed to keep her usual passive-aggressive comments to a minimum during the appetizer course. I watched the familiar dance of my waitstaff, the sommelier I'd personally trained, the way the kitchen hummed with the efficiency I'd spent decades perfecting. Every detail of this place reflected my vision, my standards, my relentless pursuit of creating something beautiful and lasting in our small city. But then came dessert, and with it, the conversation that would change everything between us forever. "You know, Rosalind," Priscilla began, her voice carrying that saccharine tone she used when she was about to say something particularly cutting. "Garrett and I have been talking, and we're really concerned about you living alone in that big house at your age." She reached across the table and patted my hand in that condescending way people do when they think you're too old to understand your own life. "We've been looking into some really lovely senior communities, places where you wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning or maintaining that old house anymore." I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "I appreciate your concern, dear, but I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." Priscilla's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, Rosalind, that's exactly what every elderly person says right before they have a fall or forget to turn off the stove. We're just being realistic about your limitations." She turned to address the tables around us, raising her voice as if she were performing for an audience. "Isn't it amazing how stubborn older people can be about admitting they need help?" That's when I felt the eyes of other diners turning toward our table, and I realized this wasn't just a private family conversation. This was a public humiliation designed to embarrass me into compliance. The couple at the neighboring table looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing they hadn't witnessed this family drama. The young woman near the window had actually taken out her phone, probably thinking she was about to witness some viral moment of elder abuse. But Priscilla wasn't finished. "The truth is," she continued, her voice growing louder and more theatrical, "you've become a burden, Rosalind. A financial burden, an emotional burden, and frankly, a social burden. Garrett's been too kind to say it, but I won't sugarcoat the truth. You're holding us back from the life we want to build together. Every Sunday dinner at your house, every holiday tradition you insist on maintaining, every time you call with some minor crisis, it's exhausting. We're young, we want to travel, we want to enjoy our marriage without constantly worrying about what crisis you're going to create next. The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter. Even the soft background music seemed muted as other patrons strained to hear this increasingly uncomfortable family confrontation. I could see my servers exchanging concerned glances near the kitchen door, probably wondering if they should intervene somehow. But I sat there, frozen, watching my own son's face as his wife systematically destroyed whatever relationship we had left. And another thing, Priscilla pressed on, apparently emboldened by Garrett's continued silence. Your constant criticism of everything I do, every choice we make, every restaurant we choose, like tonight. Do you think we don't notice how you sit there judging everything? The service, the food, the ambiance. As if you're some kind of expert on fine dining when you've barely left Millbrook in the last decade? That's when something inside me snapped. Not because of the cruelty of her words, though they cut deep. Not even because of the public humiliation, though that stung terribly. What broke something fundamental in my chest was watching my son, my own flesh and blood, sit there nodding along as his wife called me a burden in the very restaurant I'd built with my own hands. But what Priscilla didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that every word she'd just spoken had been heard not just by random strangers, but by my employees. My sommelier, who I'd mentored through his certification. My head chef, who I'd given his first professional opportunity. My general manager, who I'd promoted from busboy to leadership over 8 years of dedicated service. They all knew exactly who I was, and they'd just watched me get publicly eviscerated by a woman who thought she was embarrassing me in front of strangers. As Priscilla finally paused to take a sip of the wine she'd been drinking, wine from my personal reserve, I might add, I looked around the dining room I'd designed, at the staff I'd trained, at the legacy I'd spent 3 decades building, and I realized that this moment wasn't my humiliation. It was about to become theirs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand how devastating that Christmas dinner truly was, you need to know what Bellacorte meant to me. This wasn't just some restaurant I'd stumbled into owning. It was my life's work, my proudest achievement, and the culmination of a dream I'd carried since I was a young woman, working double shifts as a waitress in diners across 3 different states. I opened Bellacorte 31 years ago with nothing but a small inheritance from my late mother, a business loan that terrified me, and an unshakable belief that Millbrook deserved something better than chain restaurants and fast food. The building had been a failed hardware store, then a short-lived antique shop, then empty for 2 years before I saw the potential in its high ceilings and large windows overlooking Maple Street. Everyone told me I was crazy, a divorced single mother with no restaurant experience, trying to open an upscale Italian place in a town where the fanciest dining option was the steakhouse by the highway. But I had a vision. I wanted to create the kind of place where families celebrated anniversaries, where business deals were sealed over handmade pasta, where young couples had their first real dates and elderly pairs marked their golden wedding anniversaries. I spent 6 months learning everything I could about Italian cuisine, traveling to cooking schools, visiting family-owned trattorias, studying wine pairings until I could discuss terroir and tannins like I'd been born in Tuscany. The early years nearly broke me. I worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I was the hostess at night, the bookkeeper in the morning, and the cleaning crew after closing. Garrett was only 8 when I opened, and I'll admit with shame that there were too many nights when he fell asleep at table 12, homework spread across the red checkered tablecloth, while I counted receipts and planned the next day's menu. He grew up in that restaurant, learning to fold napkins and refill water glasses before he learned to ride a bike properly. Every dollar I made went back into the business. When the original chef quit after 6 months, claiming the town wasn't ready for real Italian food, I taught myself to cook well enough to keep the kitchen running until I could find his replacement. When the roof leaked during our second winter, I climbed up there myself with a bucket of tar and patching materials because I couldn't afford a contractor. When the health inspector found violations in our third year, I spent my own savings fixing every single issue within a week, then studied food safety regulations until I could recite them in my sleep. But slowly, gradually, Bellacorte became exactly what I'd envisioned. Word spread about our homemade everything: bread baked fresh twice daily, pasta rolled by hand each morning, sauces simmered for hours using recipes I'd perfected through countless trials. The wine list grew from 12 bottles to over 200 carefully curated selections that paired perfectly with our seasonal menus. The dining room filled with regulars who became like family, celebrating their milestones in the space I'd created for exactly that purpose. Over the years, Bellacorte became more than a restaurant. It became the heart of Millbrook's dining scene. We hosted wedding receptions in our private dining room, charity fundraisers that raised thousands for local causes, and holiday parties for half the businesses in town. The mayor held his campaign kickoff dinner here. The high school principal brought visiting superintendents here to impress them. Young men proposed marriage at table 7 by the window so often that I started keeping a bottle of complimentary champagne chilled just in case. I wasn't just the owner. I was the guardian of countless memories, the keeper of a space where life's most important moments unfolded over carefully prepared meals and thoughtfully chosen wines. Every review that praised our, quote, authentic atmosphere and impeccable service was a validation of the vision I'd sacrificed everything to achieve. Every customer who returned for their 10th, 20th, 50th dinner was proof that I'd created something lasting and meaningful. The financial success came eventually, though I was never flashy about it. By year 10, Bellacorte was profitable enough for me to finally pay myself a real salary. By year 15, I owned the building outright. By year 20, I had an investment portfolio that would ensure I'd never worry about money again. But I kept working because this place wasn't just my business. It was my identity, my legacy, my contribution to the world. When Garrett brought Priscilla home for the first time 3 years ago, I was so proud to show her the restaurant. I thought she'd be impressed that her future mother-in-law had built something so respected in the community. Instead, she seemed almost annoyed that I had my own success, my own reputation independent of my role as Garrett's mother. She never asked about the history of the place, never showed curiosity about how I'd managed to create something so beautiful from nothing. And now, sitting in my own dining room listening to her call me a burden while she drank my wine and criticized my decor, I realized that Priscilla saw Bellacorte the same way she saw me, as something quaint and outdated that she tolerated rather than appreciated. She had no idea that every insulting word she'd just spoken had been delivered in the house I built, surrounded by the staff I'd trained, funded by the success I'd earned through decades of sacrifice and determination. What she was about to learn was that calling someone a burden in their own kingdom isn't embarrassing for them, it's revealing for you. Looking back now, I should have seen the warning signs much earlier than that Christmas dinner. The subtle shifts in Priscilla's behavior had been building for months, but I'd explained them away as wedding stress, new marriage adjustments, or simply the natural growing pains of blending our families. What I didn't realize was that these seemingly small moments were actually test runs for the public humiliation she'd eventually unleash at Bellacorte. The first incident that should have alarmed me happened in September, during Garrett's birthday dinner at my house. I'd spent the entire day preparing his favorite meal, the same osso buco I'd been making for his birthday since he was 12, paired with saffron risotto and roasted vegetables from my garden. The dining room was set with my good china, candles flickering, and a bottle of Barolo I'd been saving for a special occasion. When they arrived, Priscilla walked through my front door carrying a large bag from Romano's, the new Italian chain restaurant that had opened near the mall. "I brought backup dinner," she announced with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes, "just in case the home cooking doesn't agree with us tonight." I felt my face flush, but I tried to keep my voice light. "Oh, I think we'll have plenty of food, dear. I've been cooking all day." "I'm sure it's lovely," she said, though she was already unpacking containers of mass-produced pasta and generic marinara sauce. "But Romano's just has this authenticity that's hard to replicate at home, you know? Their chef actually trained in Italy." The irony was almost laughable. Romano's chef had trained in Italy for exactly 6 weeks in a tourist cooking class, a fact I knew because he'd applied to work at Bellacorte 2 years earlier, and I'd politely declined after reviewing his extremely limited resume. But I couldn't say that without revealing my connection to the restaurant industry, something I'd chosen to keep private from Priscilla for reasons I was still sorting out myself. What stung wasn't her preference for chain restaurant food. Everyone has their tastes. What hurt was the deliberate undermining, the way she'd positioned her store-bought containers right next to my carefully prepared dishes, as if they were in competition. And worse, the way Garrett immediately reached for her offerings instead of the meal I'd spent hours creating for his special day. "This marinara is incredible," he said, taking a second helping of the watery red sauce. "Mom, you should try it. It might give you some ideas for your cooking." I smiled and nodded, but something cold settled in my stomach. My son was praising a $5 jar of sauce, while my homemade osso buco, made with wine that cost more than Priscilla's entire Romano's order, sat largely untouched on his plate. The next red flag came in October, during our monthly family coffee date at Brewster's Cafe downtown. I'd always treasured these Saturday morning gatherings, just the 3 of us catching up over lattes and pastries. But that particular morning, Priscilla arrived with what she called an, quote, exciting announcement. "I've been thinking," she said, stirring her coffee with unnecessary vigor, "that we need to be more strategic about our family time. Garrett and I have been talking, and we think it would be better if we rotated where we meet each month instead of always coming to the same boring places." Brewster's Cafe wasn't boring to me. It was where Garrett and I had been meeting for coffee since he was in high school, where we'd celebrated his college acceptance, where he'd first told me about Priscilla. It was our place, filled with comfortable familiarity and shared memories. "What kind of places were you thinking?" I asked, though I already suspected I wouldn't like the answer. "Well, there's this new wine bar in Riverside that has an amazing brunch menu. And there's a gastropub in Fletcher that just got reviewed in the City magazine. Places with a little more sophistication, you know? We're not getting any younger, and I think we should start experiencing more upscale venues." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Brewster's Cafe, with its mismatched chairs and homemade scones, wasn't sophisticated enough for Priscilla's evolving social standards. And by extension, neither were my choices, my preferences, or my comfort zones. But the comment that really should have prepared me for Christmas dinner came in early November, during a phone conversation that started innocently enough. Priscilla had called to ask about Thanksgiving plans, and somehow the conversation drifted to my weekly routine. "You know, Rosalind," she said in that tone I was beginning to recognize as her prelude to criticism, "Garrett mentioned that you still go grocery shopping twice a week. At your age, don't you think online delivery would be more practical?" I explained that I enjoyed selecting my own produce, chatting with the butcher about the best cuts of meat, and supporting the local businesses I'd watched grow over the decades. Shopping wasn't just an errand for me. It was part of staying connected to my community. "That's exactly what I mean," Priscilla said with a sigh that sounded almost pitying. "You're so set in these old-fashioned routines that you can't see how they're limiting you. The grocery store, that little cafe you love, even the way you insist on cooking everything from scratch. It's like you're stuck in the past." She paused, and I could hear her typing in the background, probably multitasking through our conversation. Garrett and I were just saying how difficult it must be to watch the world change around you while you stay frozen in time. It's actually kind of sad when you think about it. That phrase, frozen in time, echoed in my head for days afterward. Was that really how they saw me? As some relic from an earlier era, unable to adapt to modern life? The woman who had built a thriving business from nothing, who had navigated the constantly changing restaurant industry for 3 decades, who had embraced new technologies and trends while maintaining the timeless values that made Bellacorte special? The most troubling part wasn't even the criticism itself. It was how Priscilla delivered these observations as if she were genuinely concerned about my well-being, rather than systematically undermining my confidence. Each comment was wrapped in false compassion, making it harder to object without seeming ungrateful for her caring attention. And Garrett's response to these moments was always the same: silence. Not agreement exactly, but not defense either. He would nod non-committally, change the subject, or suddenly remember an urgent phone call he needed to make. His refusal to either support or contradict his wife left me feeling increasingly isolated and uncertain about my place in their lives. By December, I found myself second-guessing decisions I'd made confidently for years. Should I really be driving to 3 different stores to find the perfect ingredients for Sunday dinner? Was my insistence on cloth napkins and proper place settings actually quote, excessive, as Priscilla had suggested? Were my stories about the restaurant's early days boring, rather than interesting? The insidious nature of these small, undermining moments was that they chipped away at my self-assurance so gradually that I barely noticed it happening. Each individual comment seemed minor, hardly worth confronting. But together they created a pattern of diminishment that prepared the ground for the full assault I would face at Christmas dinner. What I didn't understand then was that Priscilla's strategy was deliberate. She was systematically eroding my confidence and authority within our family dynamic, testing how much disrespect I would tolerate before finally pushing back. Each successful undermining moment emboldened her to go further the next time. By the time we sat down at Bellacorte that December evening, I had been so conditioned to accept her criticism that I almost didn't recognize the outrageous escalation of calling me a burden in public. Almost. But thankfully, something deep inside me, the same instinct that had driven me to build a successful business, despite everyone's doubts, finally said enough. After those initial warning signs, Priscilla's behavior became bolder and more systematic. What had started as subtle digs wrapped in false concern evolved into outright exclusion from decisions that directly affected my relationship with my son. The pattern was so gradual that I almost convinced myself I was being oversensitive, but looking back, I can see how deliberately she was working to erase me from their lives. The first major exclusion happened in late November, just 3 weeks before that fateful Christmas dinner. Garrett called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice unusually formal and distant. "Mom, Priscilla and I have decided to spend Thanksgiving at her parents' house in Clearwater this year. Her mother isn't feeling well, and we think our presence would really boost her spirits." I felt my heart sink, but I kept my voice steady. "Of course, darling. Family comes first when someone isn't well. I hope her mother feels better soon." "Thanks for understanding," he said, though there was something hollow in his relief. "We'll make it up to you, I promise. Maybe we can do an early Christmas celebration or something." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the Thanksgiving menu I'd already planned. The same turkey and sides I'd been perfecting for 30 years. The same family recipes that Garrett had grown up requesting specifically for every holiday. I'd already ordered the free-range turkey from Henderson's farm, already made my shopping list for the cranberry sauce that took 2 days to prepare properly. But what really stung was discovering the truth 2 days later when I ran into Priscilla's friend Bethany at the pharmacy. "Oh, Rosalind," she gushed. "I'm so excited about Priscilla's Thanksgiving party at their house. She's been planning this elaborate menu for weeks. I can't wait to try her famous butternut squash bisque." Thanksgiving party. At their house. Not a family emergency in Clearwater, but a celebration I'd been deliberately excluded from while being fed a lie about sick relatives. Priscilla hadn't just chosen to spend the holiday elsewhere. She'd created an alternative gathering that specifically omitted me, while including her friends and social circle. When I gently confronted Garrett about the discrepancy, his response was worse than the original lie. "Oh, that," he said with uncomfortable laughter. "Well, Priscilla thought it might be overwhelming for you to host such a big group. You know how you get stressed about having everything perfect? We figured this way you could just relax and not worry about all the cooking and cleaning." The condescension was breathtaking. I'd been hosting Thanksgiving dinner for over 30 years, had managed holiday parties for up to 40 people at Bellacorte, and had never once complained about the work involved. But somehow, in Priscilla's narrative, I'd become a fragile elderly woman who couldn't handle the stress of preparing a meal I'd been perfecting since before she was born. The Christmas gift situation revealed another layer of systematic exclusion. In early December, I asked Garrett what Priscilla might like for Christmas, hoping to bridge the growing gap between us with a thoughtful present. His response was immediate and decisive. "Actually, Mom, Priscilla and I have decided we're not doing individual gifts this year. We're pooling our resources for a big vacation instead. A couple's retreat to Costa Rica in February." This announcement came as a shock, because gift-giving had always been important in our family. Not expensive gifts, but thoughtful ones. Homemade items, carefully chosen books, little tokens of affection that showed we'd been paying attention to each other's interests and needs. The idea of simply opting out of this tradition felt like another door being closed in my face. But the exclusion went deeper than just gifts. When I offered to contribute to their vacation fund, or even to help them plan their trip using my travel experience from the restaurant's wine-buying trips to Europe, Garrett politely declined. "That's so generous, Mom, but we've got it all figured out. Priscilla's really good at this stuff." Priscilla's really good at this stuff. That phrase started appearing more frequently in our conversations, always used to explain why my input, experience, or assistance was unnecessary. Priscilla was good at trip planning, restaurant selection, gift buying, social media management, interior decorating, essentially every area where I might have traditionally offered maternal advice or grandmother-in-law wisdom. The most hurtful exclusion, though, was learning about their house hunting expedition through a casual mention during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "We spent all weekend looking at places in Riverside," Garrett mentioned while telling me about their busy schedule. "Priscilla thinks it's time we moved somewhere with better networking opportunities for her career." House hunting. They were planning to move away from Millbrook entirely, and this was the first I'd heard of it. Not only had I not been consulted or even informed about this major life decision, but they'd been actively pursuing it for weeks without thinking to mention it to me. "How far is Riverside?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would disappoint me. "About 2 hours south. It's not that far, really. And Priscilla says the restaurant scene there is incredible, so much more sophisticated than what we have here." There it was again. The implication that Millbrook, my home, my community, my life's work, wasn't sophisticated enough for their evolving tastes. Every conversation now seemed to include some subtle criticism of our town, our local businesses, our limited cultural offerings. When I asked if they'd found anything they liked, Garrett's enthusiasm was unmistakable. "There's this amazing condo complex right downtown, walking distance to all the best restaurants and galleries. Priscilla's already talking about hosting dinner parties there. You know, really establishing ourselves in the social scene." Dinner parties. In 30 years of living in Millbrook, Priscilla had never once suggested hosting a dinner party for our local friends or community members. But apparently, the prospect of impressing strangers in Riverside was worth investing in proper entertaining. The language around these exclusions was always carefully crafted to sound reasonable, even considerate. They weren't deliberately shutting me out. They were protecting me from stress, respecting my preferences for smaller gatherings, understanding my attachment to familiar routines. Every rejection of my involvement was wrapped in the language of consideration for my supposed limitations. But the effect was unmistakable. I was being systematically removed from their decision-making process, their future planning, and their social circle. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Invitations to join them for casual outings disappeared entirely. Even our traditional Sunday dinners at my house became sporadic, often canceled at the last minute due to Priscilla's work commitments or prior social obligations. The most insidious part of this exclusion was how it made me doubt my own perceptions. When you're slowly pushed to the margins of your own family, you start wondering if maybe you really are too involved, too demanding, too set in your ways. Maybe they really were just trying to establish their independence as a couple. Maybe I really was becoming the kind of mother-in-law who needed to step back and give them space. By the time December arrived, I felt like a stranger in my own family dynamic. The easy intimacy I'd always shared with Garrett had been replaced by polite distance. Our conversations felt scripted, as if he were following talking points Priscilla had provided about how to manage his increasingly difficult mother. The cruel irony was that while I was being excluded from their personal lives, I was simultaneously being judged for not being more involved in appropriate ways. When I didn't immediately volunteer to help with wedding planning, for a wedding I'd barely been consulted about, Priscilla mentioned to mutual acquaintances how hands-off I was as a mother-in-law. When I didn't offer unsolicited advice about their finances, because I'd been trained to stay out of their business, she wondered aloud whether I really cared about their future security. I couldn't win. Too involved was intrusive, not involved enough was indifferent. The rules kept changing, always in ways that made me the problem rather than the victim of a systematic campaign to diminish my role in my son's life. What I didn't realize then was that all of this, the lies, the exclusions, the subtle undermining, was preparation for the main event. Priscilla was conditioning both Garrett and herself to see me as irrelevant, burdensome, and dispensable. By the time she stood up in my own restaurant to call me a burden in front of strangers, she'd already convinced herself that she was merely stating an obvious truth that everyone could see. She just hadn't counted on stating that truth in front of people who knew exactly who I really was. The week before Christmas, the exclusion reached a new level that left me questioning not just my place in their lives, but my own grip on reality. What had been systematic marginalization became outright erasure, and I found myself experiencing the kind of loneliness that comes from being invisible to the people who are supposed to love you most. It started with the Christmas card incident. For 30 years, I'd been helping Garrett address and send his holiday cards. It was one of our traditions. We'd spread everything out on my dining room table, share stories about the friends and family members we were writing to, and catch up on all the year's news while stuffing envelopes. Even during his college years, he'd come home specifically for quote day, bringing his address book and his terrible handwriting for me to decipher and improve. This year, when I asked him about scheduling our annual card session, he looked genuinely confused. "Oh, Mom, we already sent those out weeks ago. Priscilla handled everything through one of those online services. You know, the ones where you upload a photo and they print and mail everything for you. Super efficient." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "You already sent them? But we always do them together." "I know, but Priscilla thought it would be easier this way. Less work for everyone." He paused, seeming to realize how dismissive that sounded. "Plus, she wanted to use one of our engagement photos from the wine country trip. You know how she is about getting the perfect aesthetic for everything." The perfect aesthetic. That phrase had become Priscilla's justification for excluding me from increasingly more aspects of their lives. My handwriting wasn't aesthetic enough. My gift wrapping style wasn't aesthetic enough. My dinner table settings, my flower arrangements, my photo albums, none of it met her standards for what their life should look like. But the real blow came when I asked to see one of the cards they'd sent. Garrett pulled out his phone and showed me a glossy photo of him and Priscilla clinking wine glasses against a sunset backdrop, with elegant script reading, Warmest wishes from Garrett and Priscilla Thornfield. At the bottom, in smaller font, celebrating our first Christmas as a married couple. I stared at the image, trying to process what I was seeing. Your first Christmas as a married couple? Well, technically it is, Garrett said, though he couldn't quite meet my eyes. I mean, last year we weren't married yet. But Garrett, we've celebrated Christmas together for 31 years. This isn't your first Christmas. It's just your first as a married man. You know what I mean, Mom. It's about this new chapter in our lives. What struck me wasn't just the factual inaccuracy, but the complete erasure of our family history that it represented. In Priscilla's narrative, their life together began with their wedding, and everything that came before, including 31 years of mother-son Christmases, was irrelevant backstory rather than foundational relationship. The exclusion deepened when I discovered they'd planned an entire holiday social calendar without mentioning any of it to me. I only learned about it when Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop mentioned seeing them at the Riverside Country Club's Christmas gala. They looked so elegant, she gushed. Priscilla's dress was absolutely stunning. I'm sure you were so proud watching them on the dance floor. I smiled and nodded, but my heart was racing. They'd attended a formal Christmas event, the kind of celebration I would have loved to hear about, maybe even attend as Garrett's guest, and I'd known nothing about it. When I casually mentioned Mrs. Patterson's comment during our next phone call, Garrett's response was maddeningly casual. Oh, that. It was just a work thing for Priscilla. You know how those corporate events are? Pretty boring, actually. Just a bunch of networking and small talk. But Mrs. Patterson's description of elegant dresses and dancing didn't sound like boring corporate networking. It sounded like exactly the kind of sophisticated social event that Priscilla had been pushing them toward all year, and I'd been completely excluded from even knowing it existed. The pattern extended to their holiday shopping as well. In previous years, Garrett and I had spent at least one afternoon shopping together, him seeking advice on gifts for his friends, and me enjoying the chance to see what caught his eye in different stores. This year, when I suggested we plan a shopping trip, he told me they'd already finished all their Christmas shopping online. Priscilla's really good at finding unique gifts, he explained. She spent hours researching artisanal vendors and small businesses. Everything's already wrapped and under the tree. Under their tree, in their apartment, selected and wrapped, without any input from me. Even the act of gift-giving, which had always been a collaborative family effort, had been privatized and professionalized by Priscilla's superior organizational skills. The social media exclusion was perhaps the most painful because it was so visible to others. Throughout December, Priscilla posted constant updates about their holiday activities, decorating their tree, attending parties, hosting friends for dinner, visiting Christmas markets in nearby cities. Every photo showed a happy couple creating memories and traditions, but I appeared in none of them. Not as a photographer, not as a companion, not even as a mention in captions about family time. To anyone following their social media, it would appear that Garrett had no mother at all. Their holiday season was a carefully curated display of couples' independence, with no acknowledgement that he'd been celebrating Christmas with someone else for 3 decades, before Priscilla entered the picture. When I mentioned feeling left out of their holiday celebrations, Garrett's response revealed how completely he'd internalized Priscilla's narrative about my supposed limitations. Mom, you always say you prefer quiet holidays at home. We didn't want to drag you to a bunch of events you wouldn't enjoy. I had never said I preferred quiet holidays. What I had said was that I enjoyed our intimate family traditions, the ones that were now being systematically replaced by more sophisticated alternatives. But somehow, my appreciation for our long-standing customs had been reinterpreted as a preference for isolation. Besides, he continued, Priscilla thought you might feel uncomfortable at some of these events. You know how she worries about you feeling out of place in unfamiliar social situations. Priscilla worried about me feeling out of place. The woman who had never asked about my comfort level at any event, who had never inquired about my social preferences or interests, had somehow designated herself the expert on my emotional needs and social capabilities. The most devastating exclusion came just 2 days before Christmas, when I learned about their New Year's plans. Not from them, but from a conversation I overheard while picking up my dry cleaning. The woman ahead of me in line was excitedly discussing the amazing New Year's party that Garrett and his wife were hosting at their apartment. A New Year's party. My son was hosting his first major social event as a married man, and I'd learned about it from a stranger at the dry cleaners. When I called him that evening to ask about it, his discomfort was palpable. "It's just a small thing, Mom, really casual. Priscilla invited a few people from work and some neighbors. You'd probably find it pretty loud and chaotic." How many people? Maybe 20? 25? It's hard to say exactly. 25 people wasn't small, and hosting that many guests in their one-bedroom apartment wasn't casual. It was a significant social event that required planning, preparation, and considerable effort, the kind of hosting challenge I would have been happy to help with or at least offer advice about. But instead, I was being preemptively protected from the chaos of my own son's party. I could help with the food preparation, I offered, or bring some appetizers from. "That's really sweet, Mom, but Priscilla's got everything under control. She's actually pretty excited about doing it all herself. You know how she likes to have everything just so." Everything just so, which apparently meant without me. By Christmas Eve, I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of my own family. Every tradition we'd built together had been replaced. Every role I'd played had been reassigned to Priscilla, and every attempt I made to reconnect was politely but firmly redirected. I wasn't being rejected with anger or hostility. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, I was being gently, systematically erased with kindness and consideration for my supposed well-being. The cruelest part was how reasonable it all sounded when explained individually. Of course they wanted to establish their own traditions as a couple. Of course they needed to build social connections in their professional circles. Of course they were trying to be considerate of my age and energy levels. But taken together, these considerations formed a wall that kept me completely separate from their lives while maintaining the illusion that they were being thoughtful and caring. I was being suffocated with kindness, excluded with concern, and erased with love. As I sat alone in my house on Christmas Eve, surrounded by decorations that suddenly felt pointless and preparations that seemed foolish, I wondered if this was how it would always be now. Was this my future? Watching my son's life unfold from a distance, learning about his milestones from strangers, being protected from participation in my own family. I had no idea that the next evening would answer that question in the most shocking way possible. The morning after Christmas, I was still reeling from the humiliation at Bellacorte, but what I discovered that day would prove that Priscilla's public insults were just the tip of an iceberg I'd been too trusting to see. I'd spent a sleepless night replaying every word of her performance, every moment of Garrett's silent complicity, and I kept coming back to one detail that didn't make sense. How had they afforded to eat at Bellacorte so frequently when Garrett had been complaining about money for months? The answer came when I decided to do something I'd never done before, really examine my financial accounts with the thoroughness I applied to my restaurant's books. What I found made me question everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my son and his wife. It started with my credit card statements. While reviewing the December charges, I noticed several purchases at stores I'd never visited. Nordstrom, Williams-Sonoma, an expensive wine shop in Riverside. The amounts weren't huge individually. $200 here, $300 there. But they added up to over $1. 500 in purchases I definitely hadn't made. When I called the credit card company, the representative confirmed that all the charges had been made with my card, not fraudulent copies. "Ma'am, it shows here that an authorized user was added to your account in September. Would you like me to read you the name on file?" My heart sank before she even said it. Priscilla Thornfield. I had no memory of authorizing Priscilla to use my credit card. None whatsoever. But apparently, according to their records, I'd called in September to add her as an authorized user, complete with a secondary card mailed to their address. The representative even read me the last 4 digits of my Social Security number that had been used to verify the request. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen trying to reconstruct how this could have happened. Then I remembered. September was when I'd been recovering from my minor outpatient surgery. Garrett had insisted on handling some of my paperwork while I was groggy from the anesthesia, saying he wanted to make sure all my bills were paid on time. I'd given him access to my purse, my wallet, my personal documents, trusting him completely to take care of everything while I recovered. Apparently, taking care of everything had included setting up his wife with unlimited access to my credit accounts. But the credit card was just the beginning. When I logged into my bank account online, I discovered a pattern of transfers that made my stomach turn. Every month since October, $800 had been automatically transferred from my savings account to Garrett and Priscilla's joint checking account. The memo line read, "Family support," as if this were some official arrangement we'd all agreed upon. Family support. $800 a month, transferred without my knowledge or consent, supposedly to help them with their expenses. I calculated quickly. They'd already taken $2, $400 from my savings, plus whatever they'd charged on my credit card. The online banking system showed that the automatic transfer had been set up through a phone call in October, using my account information and security questions. Again, I had no memory of authorizing this, but I did remember Garrett helping me with some routine account maintenance during another visit when I had been feeling overwhelmed by technology. My hands were shaking as I called the bank's customer service line. The representative who handled my inquiry was sympathetic but firm. All the transactions appeared legitimate because they'd been authorized using my correct personal information. To dispute them, I'd need to file a formal complaint alleging fraud by a family member, which would trigger an investigation and potentially criminal charges. "Are you saying your son stole from you, ma'am?" the representative asked gently. I couldn't answer that question. Not yet. Because stolen implied taken without permission, and I was starting to realize that Garrett and Priscilla had been much more clever than that. They'd obtained my permission when I was vulnerable, distracted, or trusting, then used that permission far beyond what I'd ever intended to authorize. But the financial discoveries were only part of the puzzle. Later that afternoon, while looking for my insurance documents, I found a folder in Garrett's old bedroom that I'd never seen before. Inside were printouts of emails between him and Priscilla, apparently forgotten during their last visit to my house. The emails revealed a level of calculation that took my breath away. They'd been planning their systematic exclusion of me for months, discussing strategies for reducing my influence in their lives while maximizing the financial benefits of maintaining a relationship with me. One email from Priscilla to Garrett, dated in early November, was particularly chilling. "Your mom's getting too clingy about the holidays. We need to start setting boundaries now, or she'll expect to be included in everything forever." The Christmas dinner at Bellacorte could be the perfect opportunity to make our position clear. Public setting means she won't make a scene, and afterward we can point to her, overreaction, as proof that she's becoming difficult to manage. Public setting means she won't make a scene. They'd chosen my own restaurant specifically because they thought I'd be too embarrassed to defend myself in front of strangers. The location wasn't coincidental. It was strategic. Another email thread discussed my finances with a level of detail that suggested they'd been monitoring my accounts for much longer than I'd realized. Priscilla had apparently researched my net worth using public records, property assessments, and even my restaurant's business filings. They knew exactly how much money I had, where it was invested, and what I'd be able to afford to help them with. "She's worth at least $2.3 million, Priscilla had written. The restaurant property alone is valued at $800K, plus her house and investments. Even if she lives another 20 years, she can't possibly spend all of that. We should be thinking long-term about how to position ourselves as her primary beneficiaries." Primary beneficiaries. They weren't just stealing from me in the present. They were planning to inherit everything I'd worked for, while simultaneously arguing that I was a burden on their lives. The most devastating email was one Garrett had sent to Priscilla just days before Christmas dinner. "I think you're right about the assisted living idea. If we can convince her that she's becoming too much to handle, we could probably get her to move somewhere more manageable within 6 months. Then we could rent out her house for extra income while keeping it as an investment property. The restaurant situation is trickier, but there might be ways to get her to bring us in as partners if we frame it as helping her with the business side." Assisted living. They'd been planning to institutionalize me, not out of concern for my well-being, but to gain control of my assets. The burden narrative wasn't just emotional manipulation. It was the foundation for a financial takeover that would leave me isolated and them wealthy. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was a series of text messages between them from the night of Christmas dinner. After publicly humiliating me at Bellacorte, they'd continued their conversation in writing, apparently too excited by their successful performance to wait until they got home. "Priscilla, that went perfectly. Did you see how quiet she got? I think we really got through to her tonight." "Garrett, she definitely looked shaken. Think she'll actually consider the assisted living options now?" "Priscilla, absolutely. A few more conversations like that, and she'll be begging us to help her find a nice facility. The key is making her think it was her idea." "Garrett, what about the restaurant thing? Should we start bringing that up soon?" "Priscilla, let's get her moved first. Then we can talk about how hard it must be to manage a business at her age. Once she's in assisted living, she'll probably be grateful to hand over the day-to-day operations to people she trusts." People she trusts. Even as they were plotting to steal my life's work, they were congratulating themselves on being trustworthy enough to manage my affairs for me. Reading those messages felt like being punched in the chest repeatedly. This wasn't a case of young people being thoughtless, or a daughter-in-law being territorial. This was a calculated, long-term plan to systematically destroy my independence, my confidence, and my control over my own life, all while positioning themselves as my caring family who only wanted what was best for me. As I sat surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, I realized that everything, the credit card authorization, the bank transfers, the social exclusions, the Christmas dinner humiliation, had been designed to accomplish one goal: making me so demoralized and dependent that I'd willingly hand over control of everything I'd spent my life building. They'd studied me like a business acquisition, identified my vulnerabilities, and developed a comprehensive strategy for taking over my assets while making me grateful for their attention. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on in their careful planning. They'd made their calculations based on the assumption that I was just a lonely old woman with money, not a successful businesswoman who'd built an empire through 30 years of careful strategy and tough decision-making. They'd forgotten that the same instincts that had made me successful in business would eventually kick in when I realized I was being played. And now that I knew the truth about their intentions, it was time to remind them exactly who they were trying to manipulate. Armed with the devastating evidence I'd uncovered, I spent the next few days digging deeper, and what I found revealed a betrayal so comprehensive and calculating that it took my breath away. This wasn't just about stolen money or hurt feelings. They had created an entire false reality designed to gaslight me into believing I was incompetent, while they systematically dismantled my life from the inside. The depth of their deception became clear when I discovered they'd been intercepting my mail for months. While going through the papers in Garrett's old room more thoroughly, I found a box hidden behind his high school yearbooks containing dozens of pieces of my mail that had been redirected to their apartment. Bank statements, investment notices, insurance documents, even correspondence from my accountant, all opened, read, and filed away without my knowledge. They had been monitoring every aspect of my financial life while I remained completely unaware. The bank statements showed not just the unauthorized transfers I'd already discovered, but a pattern of smaller charges I'd missed, automatic subscriptions to services I'd never signed up for, recurring donations to charities I'd never heard of, even monthly payments to a meal delivery service that apparently sent food to their apartment. The insurance documents were perhaps the most chilling discovery. Someone had contacted my life insurance company in November to, quote, update beneficiary information. The paperwork showed that Garrett had been changed from a beneficiary to the primary beneficiary, and Priscilla had been added as a secondary beneficiary with rights to the full payout if anything happened to Garrett. Most disturbing of all, someone had increased my coverage by $500,000, supposedly at my request. I called my insurance agent immediately. "Mrs. Thornfield," she said warmly, "so good to hear from you. How are you feeling after your health scare last month?" My blood ran cold. "What health scare?" There was a pause. "Oh, I assumed you knew that your son called to report that you'd been having some concerning symptoms. Memory issues, confusion, difficulty managing your affairs. He was worried about your capacity to make important decisions and wanted to make sure your coverage was adequate in case your condition deteriorated. Memory issues, confusion, difficulty managing affairs. Garrett had told my insurance company that I was developing dementia, using that false narrative to justify increasing my life insurance and positioning himself as my primary decision-maker. The insurance company now had it on record that I was mentally incompetent, which would make any future claims about my capacity to manage my own affairs much more difficult to dispute. But the betrayal went even deeper than financial fraud and insurance manipulation. Hidden in the same box of intercepted mail, I found correspondence with assisted living facilities that made my stomach turn. They hadn't just been casually researching options for my future care. They'd been actively touring facilities, requesting detailed pricing information, and even putting down deposits to hold spots for me. One brochure from Serenity Gardens, an upscale assisted living community 2 hours away from Millbrook, had handwritten notes in Priscilla's distinctive script: "Memory care unit available. Private room $4, $200 per month. Can we get POA to cover costs from her investments? Power of attorney." They were planning to have me declared incompetent so they could legally control all my finances while warehousing me in an expensive facility far from anyone who knew me. The most damning evidence, though, was a detailed timeline they'd created, apparently planning every step of my downfall with the precision of a military operation. The document, titled Transition Planning for R, outlined a 6-month strategy for moving me into assisted living while taking control of all my assets. Phase 1, which they'd already completed, involved establishing pattern of cognitive decline through false reports to my doctor, insurance company, and bank. They'd been telling people I was becoming forgetful, calling to correct supposed mistakes I'd made, and generally creating a paper trail that would support their eventual claim that I needed a guardian. Phase 2 called for kick Phase 2 kick me believe I was incapable of handling them myself. The Christmas dinner humiliation was specifically listed as a strategy to, demonstrate inappropriate social behavior in public setting. Phase 3 involved intervention and placement, where they would stage a family meeting to express their concerns about my ability to live independently, present the assisted living facility as a solution, and have me moved within 30 days. Phase 4 was titled Asset Management, and detailed exactly how they plan to liquidate my investments, sell my house, and position themselves as the managing partners of Bellacorte. They'd researched the legal requirements for taking over a family business when the owner was declared incompetent, and they'd already identified lawyers who specialized in elder law guardianship cases. The document even included contingency plans for different scenarios. If I resisted their placement efforts, they had contact information for Adult Protective Services and planned to report me as a vulnerable adult who was being neglected. If I tried to challenge their authority, they had multiple witnesses prepared to testify about my supposed cognitive decline, including friends of Priscilla's who had never even met me, but were willing to provide false statements about concerning interactions they'd supposedly witnessed. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was evidence that they'd been planning this manipulation since before their wedding. Email threads dating back 18 months showed Priscilla researching my financial situation, my property holdings, and even my health records through Garrett's access to my medical information as my emergency contact. "The key is making everything look natural," Priscilla had written to Garrett in an email from last spring. "We can't rush the process or it'll look suspicious. But if we're patient and systematic, we can have everything in place within 2 years. She trusts you completely, which gives us unlimited access to whatever information we need." They'd been studying me like a mark in a long con, identifying my weaknesses, documenting my routines, and carefully manipulating my environment to make me doubt my own competence. Every kind gesture, every expression of concern, every offer to help had been calculated to serve their ultimate goal of taking everything I'd worked for. The emails also revealed that they'd been using information gathered from my restaurant to enhance their social standing in Riverside. Priscilla had been posting online reviews of other restaurants using insider knowledge she'd gained from my conversations about the industry, positioning herself as a food and wine expert. She'd even applied for a job at a high-end restaurant in Riverside, using fake references and inflated experience that included claims about, quote, managing family restaurant operations. She was literally building a career on stolen expertise from my life's work, while simultaneously planning to destroy my ability to continue that work. The scope of their planning was breathtaking in its thoroughness and chilling in its callousness. They'd anticipated every possible objection I might raise, every legal challenge I might mount, and every emotional appeal I might make. They'd spent months building a fortress of false documentation, fraudulent testimonies, and manipulated evidence that would make it nearly impossible for me to prove my own competence once they triggered their final phase. What made it even more devastating was realizing how many people they'd already convinced. My doctor's office had notes about my supposed memory problems. My bank had flags on my account about potential cognitive issues. Even some of my longtime friends had apparently been told that I was struggling and that Garrett and Priscilla were doing their best to help me maintain my independence as long as possible. They'd poisoned my reputation and undermined my credibility with systematic precision, all while maintaining the facade of loving, concerned family members who only wanted what was best for me. As I sat surrounded by evidence of their comprehensive betrayal, I realized that everything I'd attributed to thoughtlessness, generational differences, or normal family growing pains had actually been part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy my life. The hurt feelings, the social exclusions, the gradual erosion of my confidence, none of it had been accidental. They'd turned my own love for my son into a weapon against me, using my desire to maintain our relationship to keep me compliant, while they systematically stole my money, my reputation, and my future. But there was one thing their meticulous planning hadn't accounted for. They'd made the mistake of trying to con someone who had built a successful business through decades of reading people, spotting deception, and making strategic decisions under pressure. Now that I understood the full scope of their game, it was time to show them what a real strategist could do when she stopped playing defense and went on the attack. The confrontation I'd been avoiding for months finally happened 3 days after my devastating discoveries, but this time I wasn't the confused, hurt mother-in-law they'd been manipulating. I was a business owner who'd just uncovered a systematic fraud operation, and I was done playing their game by their rules. I invited them to lunch at my house under the pretense of wanting to talk through some concerns about our relationship. They arrived looking pleased with themselves, probably assuming this was the beginning of my surrender to their assisted living plans. Priscilla carried a leather portfolio that I suspected contained brochures and paperwork for the facilities they'd been researching. "Mom, you look tired," Garrett said as soon as he walked in, his voice carrying that patronizing concern I now recognized as a weapon. "Are you sleeping okay? Priscilla mentioned she's been worried about you since Christmas dinner." There it was, the opening move in their playbook. Express false concern. Plant seeds of doubt about my competence. position themselves as the caring family members who were simply trying to help. But this time, instead of defending my well-being or explaining away their concerns, I smiled and gestured toward the dining room table. Actually, I've been sleeping very well. Amazing how much better you rest when you finally understand what's really going on around you. They exchanged a quick glance, the first crack in their confident facade. I'd already laid out all the evidence on my dining room table like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Bank statements, credit card records, the intercepted mail, printouts of their emails, photos of the insurance documents, and their detailed transition planning for our timeline spread across the surface like a map of their deception. Priscilla's face went completely white when she saw her own handwriting on the assisted living brochures. Garrett's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to speak but couldn't find words. "Please, sit down," I said calmly, taking my place at the head of the table, the same position I'd occupied through 30 years of family dinners, business meetings, and difficult conversations. "We have a lot to discuss." "Mom, what is all this?" Garrett asked, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "This," I said, picking up the timeline document, "is evidence of the most comprehensive fraud operation I've ever encountered. And considering I've been running a business for 3 decades, that's saying something." Priscilla finally found her voice, but it came out as a whisper. "I don't know what you think you found, but I think," I interrupted, "that I found exactly what you left for me to find. The question is whether you're both naive enough to believe you could pull this off, or arrogant enough to think I'd never figure it out." I started with the financial fraud, walking them through each unauthorized transaction with the methodical precision I used when reviewing Bellacorte's books. The credit card charges, the bank transfers, the insurance changes, every theft documented and dated. $800 a month, I said, looking directly at Garrett, for 6 months, plus another $1,500 in unauthorized credit card charges. That's $6,400 you've stolen from me so far, not counting the increased insurance premiums I've been paying on coverage I never requested. "Mom, you're making this sound worse than it is," Garrett started, but I held up my hand. "I'm making this sound exactly like what it is, theft, from your own mother, while telling everyone who would listen that I'm too mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs." That's when Priscilla's mask finally slipped completely. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law disappeared, replaced by someone I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and furious at being caught. "You have no idea what we've been dealing with," she snapped. "Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly worry about an elderly person who refuses to acknowledge their limitations? We've been trying to help you transition gracefully, but you're too stubborn to see that you need assistance." "Assistance?" I repeated slowly. "Is that what you call lying to my insurance company about non-existent health problems? Is that what you call intercepting my mail and monitoring my bank accounts without permission? Is that what you call putting deposits down on assisted living facilities without my knowledge?" "We were being proactive," Garrett said, though he couldn't meet my eyes. "We wanted to have options available when you were ready to make the transition. When I was ready, I pulled out their Phase 3 documentation. According to your timeline, I was supposed to be moved to Serenity Gardens within 30 days of your intervention. That doesn't sound like waiting for me to be ready. That sounds like forcing me out whether I agreed or not." The silence that followed was deafening. They'd run out of explanations, excuses, and deflections. For the first time since I'd known them, they were confronted with undeniable evidence of their actions, and no way to spin it as concern for my welfare. But Priscilla wasn't finished fighting. When cornered, she revealed exactly who she really was. "Fine," she said, her voice turning vicious. "You want the truth? The truth is that you are a burden, Rosalind. You're a lonely old woman clinging to the past, refusing to accept that your son has a new life that doesn't revolve around you. We've been trying to handle this diplomatically, but since you want to be difficult about it, let's be honest." She stood up, pacing behind her chair like a lawyer addressing a jury. "You live alone in a house that's too big for you. running a restaurant that could be managed much more efficiently by people who understand modern business practices. You spend money on outdated systems and maintain traditions that don't make financial sense. You're holding on to assets that could be generating real wealth if they were properly managed. Properly managed by whom? I asked quietly. By people who understand how to maximize return on investment. By people who aren't emotionally attached to the way things used to be. By people who can see the big picture instead of getting caught up in sentimental nonsense about family recipes and handwritten notes. There it was, the truth I'd been too blind to see. To Priscilla, I wasn't a person with feelings, memories, and a lifetime of achievements. I was a poorly managed portfolio that needed professional oversight. My restaurant wasn't a beloved community institution. It was an underperforming asset. My house wasn't my home. It was valuable real estate being wasted on someone too old to appreciate its potential. And you, Garrett? I asked, turning to my son. Is that how you see me too? As a mismanaged investment opportunity? For a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy I'd raised, embarrassed, ashamed, wanting to take back everything that had been said. But then Priscilla put her hand on his shoulder, and his expression hardened again. Mom, you have to understand that we're not the enemy here. We're trying to help you face reality. You can't run a restaurant forever. You can't live independently forever. We're offering to take care of everything so you don't have to worry about these responsibilities anymore. Take care of everything, I repeated, including the profits from my restaurant, the equity in my house, and the investments I've spent 30 years building. Someone has to, Priscilla said with stunning audacity, and who better than family who actually care about your future? That's when I started laughing. Not hysterical laughter, but the kind of genuine amusement you feel when someone reveals themselves to be exactly as foolish as you suspected. You know what's fascinating about this whole conversation? I said, still chuckling. You've spent months researching my assets, my business operations, my financial situation. You've documented my routines, studied my relationships, and planned your takeover with remarkable attention to detail. I stood up, walking around the table to where they sat frozen in their chairs. But in all your careful planning, you made one critical error. You assumed that a 72-year-old woman who built a successful business from nothing, who survived divorce, raised a child as a single mother, and created a respected institution in this community, would be too weak, too confused, or too desperate for family connection to fight back when she discovered she was being robbed. I leaned down, speaking directly to Priscilla with the same tone I used with suppliers who tried to cheat me on invoices. You picked the wrong mark, sweetheart. And now you're about to learn exactly what happens when you try to con someone who spent 30 years outmaneuvering people who thought they were smarter than her. The morning after my confrontation with Garrett and Priscilla, I woke up with the kind of clarity I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't reacting to their moves. I was planning my own. And unlike their amateur hour manipulation tactics, my strategy would be executed with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 decades making tough business decisions under pressure. My first call was to David Chen, the attorney who'd handled all of Bellacorte's legal matters for the past 15 years. David had helped me navigate everything from contract disputes to employment issues, and more importantly, he knew me well enough to understand that when I called with an urgent matter, it wasn't because I was a confused elderly woman having delusions. Rosalind, he said when I reached him at his office, what can I do for you? I need to discuss a family matter that's become a legal matter, I said. How quickly can we meet? How about this afternoon? And Rosalind, bring everything. David's office overlooked downtown Millbrook, and from his conference room window I could see Bellacorte's awning 2 blocks away. As I spread out all the evidence I'd gathered, the intercepted mail, the fraudulent transfers, the insurance documents, their planning timeline, I felt like I was conducting a business meeting rather than discussing my personal catastrophe. The emotional devastation was still there, but it was now channeled into strategic thinking. "This is comprehensive fraud," David said after reviewing everything. "Credit card fraud, identity theft, mail theft, insurance fraud, and that's just the financial crimes. The elder abuse implications are serious as well." "What are my options?" "Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, restraining orders. You could pursue all of them. But let me ask you something first. What outcome do you actually want here?" It was the perfect question, and one that forced me to think beyond my immediate anger. Did I want Garrett in prison? Did I want a public trial that would expose our family's dirty laundry to the entire community? Did I want to spend the next 2 years of my life in courtrooms instead of running my restaurant? "I want them to understand that actions have consequences," I said finally. "I want my money back, I want them out of my life, and I want assurance that they'll never try anything like this again." "Then we're going to need leverage," David said with a smile I'd seen before when he was preparing to outmaneuver an opponent. "And fortunately, they've given us plenty to work with." While David began preparing the legal documentation that would become my insurance policy, I made my second strategic call to Patricia Morrison, the private investigator who'd helped me when I suspected one of my former employees was embezzling from the restaurant. Patricia specialized in financial crimes, and she had access to resources that could trace money trails and document fraudulent activities with the kind of precision that would hold up in court. "I need a complete financial audit," I told her. "Every transaction, every authorization, every document. I want to know exactly how much they've stolen and exactly how they did it. How far back do you want me to go?" From the day Garrett got engaged to Priscilla, I have a feeling this goes back further than I realized. Patricia's investigation would take several days, but in the meantime, I began implementing the immediate protective measures David had recommended. I changed every password on every account, revoked all authorized user privileges, and placed fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus. I also did something that felt both liberating and terrifying. I removed Garrett as my emergency contact and power of attorney, replacing him with David. For 31 years, my son had been the person I trusted to make decisions if I couldn't make them myself. Removing him from that role felt like amputating part of my heart, but I knew it was necessary. If they'd been willing to lie to my insurance company about my mental capacity, they wouldn't hesitate to use emergency medical situations to gain control of my affairs. My next move was more subtle but equally important. I began quietly reaching out to the people Garrett and Priscilla had contacted with false information about my supposed cognitive decline. Dr. Williams, my physician for 20 years, was first on the list. "Helen," I said when I called his office, "I understand my son has been calling with concerns about my mental state. I'd like to schedule a comprehensive cognitive evaluation so we can clear up any confusion." Dr. Williams was obviously uncomfortable. "Rosalind, I've known you for 2 decades. If you want a cognitive evaluation, we can certainly arrange that. But I have to say that in our conversations, I've never noticed any signs of cognitive decline." "Then why do you have notes in my file suggesting otherwise?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. "Your son was very persuasive when he called. He seemed genuinely concerned, and family members are often the first to notice subtle changes. Perhaps I should have insisted on speaking with you directly." "Perhaps you should have," I agreed. "Let's schedule that evaluation for next week. I want everything documented properly." I made similar calls to my bank, my insurance company, and even my accountant. In each case, I discovered that Garrett had been laying groundwork for months, painting a picture of a woman whose mental faculties were deteriorating. But in each case, the professionals I'd worked with for years admitted that they'd found the reports inconsistent with their own observations of my behavior. The insurance company representative was particularly helpful. "Mrs. Thornfield, I have to tell you that your son's report was unusual. Most family members who call about cognitive concerns ask about reducing coverage or adjusting policies to protect the insured person. Your son specifically asked about increasing coverage and changing beneficiaries. It raised some flags, but we assumed you'd authorized him to make those inquiries. I authorized nothing, I said firmly, and I'd like a complete review of any changes made to my policies in the past year. While I was systematically undoing the damage they'd done to my reputation and my affairs, I also began what I considered the most important part of my strategy: documenting everything myself. I started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction, every phone call, every discovery. If this situation ever did end up in court, I wanted a contemporaneous record of exactly what had happened and when. But perhaps my most crucial strategic move was reaching out to my restaurant's management team. Elena Rodriguez, my general manager, had been with Bellacorte for 8 years and knew every aspect of the operation. If Garrett and Priscilla were planning to take over the restaurant, I needed to make sure they wouldn't be able to manipulate my staff or access sensitive business information. Elena, I said during our meeting in my office above the restaurant, I need to ask you about any contact you've had with my son or his wife regarding restaurant operations. Her face immediately darkened. Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about that. Priscilla came by last week asking questions about our vendor contracts and staffing costs. She said you'd asked her to do some research about modernizing our operations. My blood ran cold. I never asked her to research anything. I didn't think so. She didn't know enough about the restaurant business to be asking the right questions, but she was very insistent that she had your authorization. I didn't give her any specific information, but I wanted to check with you first. From now on, I said, no one gets access to any business information without my direct, written authorization. And Elena, if anyone contacts you claiming to be concerned about my mental health or my ability to run this restaurant, I want to know immediately. Elena nodded, but then asked the question I'd been dreading. Rosalind, is everything okay? This sounds serious. For a moment, I considered giving her a sanitized version of events, but I realized that protecting my business meant trusting the people who helped me run it. So I told her everything: the financial fraud, the manipulation, the systematic campaign to have me declared incompetent. They're planning to take over the restaurant? Elena asked, her voice incredulous. They were planning to take over everything, I confirmed, but planning and succeeding are two different things. Elena leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. They have no idea what they're dealing with, do they? I've watched you handle suppliers, difficult customers, health inspectors, tax audits, equipment failures, staff emergencies. You don't just run this restaurant. You are this restaurant. Anyone who thinks you're an easy target has never seen you in action. Her confidence in me was exactly what I needed to hear. Because she was right, Garrett and Priscilla had made their plans based on the assumption that I was a vulnerable elderly woman, not a seasoned business owner who'd survived and thrived in one of the most challenging industries in the world. They'd studied my finances and my routines, but they'd never bothered to understand my capabilities or my resources. They'd seen an aging woman living alone and assumed weakness, never considering that the same skills that had built Bellacorte from nothing were exactly the skills I'd need to defend everything I'd worked for. By the end of that week, I'd built a fortress around my assets, my reputation, and my business. Every vulnerability they'd exploited had been secured. Every lie they'd told had been documented and corrected. Every advantage they thought they had was now working against them. I was no longer playing defense against their manipulations. I was ready to go on the offensive. And they were about to discover that they'd picked a fight with someone who knew how to win. Patricia Morrison's investigation results arrived exactly 1 week after I'd hired her, and they were even more damning than I'd expected. The private investigator had traced financial irregularities going back not just to Garrett's engagement, but to the very first time he'd brought Priscilla home to meet me. What I'd thought was a 6-month fraud operation turned out to be an 18-month systematic theft that had been escalating gradually to avoid detection. They were testing you, Patricia explained as we sat in David Chen's conference room, surrounded by bankers' boxes full of evidence. Small amounts at first. $20 here, $50 there. Probably to see if you'd notice unauthorized charges. When you didn't catch those, they got bolder. The complete audit revealed over $23,000 in stolen funds across multiple accounts and fraudulent charges. They'd opened store credit cards in my name, taken cash advances on my credit lines, and even applied for a home equity loan against my house. Most shocking of all, they'd been systematically transferring small amounts from my business accounts at Bellacorte, money I'd assumed were normal fluctuations in our operating expenses. They had help, Patricia continued, showing me bank records that made my stomach turn. Someone with inside knowledge of restaurant operations helped them identify which accounts to target and when transfers would be least likely to be noticed. I thought immediately of Marcus Webb, the assistant manager I'd fired 6 months ago for repeatedly arriving late and showing poor judgment with customers. Garrett had actually defended Marcus during that situation, suggesting I was being too harsh and that young people deserved second chances. Now I wondered if Garrett's defense had been motivated by more than just generosity. David spread out the legal documents he'd prepared like a general planning a military campaign. "We have enough evidence for multiple felony charges," he said. "Wire fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, conspiracy. Any prosecutor in the state would take this case, but I think we can get better results through strategic pressure than through criminal court." The strategy David had developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than immediately filing criminal charges, we would present Garrett and Priscilla with irrefutable evidence of their crimes and give them exactly one opportunity to make things right voluntarily. If they refused or tried to negotiate, then we'd pursue every legal remedy available with the full force of the law. The beauty of this approach, David explained, is that it gives them a chance to avoid prison while ensuring you get full restitution. And if they're stupid enough to refuse, we'll have documented their lack of remorse, which will help with sentencing, if it comes to that. The first step was serving them with a cease and desist order that detailed every crime they'd committed, demanded immediate return of all stolen funds, and prohibited any further contact with me, my business, or my financial institutions. The document was 37 pages long and included photographic evidence of forged signatures, recorded phone calls where they'd impersonated me to financial institutions, and a timeline showing premeditated planning dating back 18 months. Patricia had also uncovered something that gave us additional leverage. Priscilla's job application at the upscale restaurant in Riverside contained false references and fabricated experience that constituted employment fraud. Her LinkedIn profile claimed she'd been a restaurant operations consultant for the past 2 years, with my establishment listed as a client reference, complete with a fake testimonial supposedly written by me praising her expertise in modernizing traditional dining concepts. "She's been building an entire career on stolen credentials," Patricia noted. "If her employer finds out, she'll not only lose her job but potentially face criminal charges for employment fraud as well." David scheduled the confrontation for the following Thursday at his office, neutral ground where everything would be recorded and witnessed. I wanted to be present for this meeting, not just to see their faces when they realized how thoroughly they'd been caught, but to make sure they understood that their victim was anything but the helpless elderly woman they'd assumed I was. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., but David and I arrived early to prepare. He'd arranged for a court reporter to document everything, and Patricia would be present as a witness. We also had a representative from the district attorney's office standing by, ready to file charges immediately if Garrett and Priscilla refused to cooperate. When they walked into the conference room at exactly 2 p.m., I could see they were trying to project confidence, but Priscilla's hands were shaking as she set down her purse. Garrett looked like he hadn't slept in days. Clearly, the past week of having their financial accounts frozen and their credit cards canceled had given them a preview of what their future might look like. "Thank you both for coming." David began with professional courtesy that somehow made the situation feel even more ominous. "We're here to discuss some serious legal matters that have come to our attention regarding Mrs. Thornfield's finances and personal affairs." He began with the financial crimes, methodically walking through each fraudulent transaction while Patricia projected supporting evidence on a large screen. Bank statements, forged signatures, recorded phone calls. Everything was documented with the kind of precision that left no room for denial or excuse. In total, David announced, we've documented $23,347 in fraudulent charges and unauthorized transfers over an 18-month period. This constitutes felony theft in the first degree, wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse under state law. Priscilla's face had gone completely white. We never meant for it to go this far, she whispered. Meant for what to go this far? David asked. The theft? The fraud? The systematic campaign to have Mrs. Thornfield declared mentally incompetent? Which part exactly did you not mean to go this far? That's when he produced their own planning documents. The timeline, the emails, the assisted living research. Seeing their own words projected on the screen, their own handwriting magnified for everyone to read, was devastating in its impact. There was no way to claim misunderstanding or good intentions when their predatory planning was laid out in their own detailed documentation. Jesus, Garrett muttered, putting his head in his hands. How did you get all of this? Your mother is a businesswoman, David replied simply. She knows how to conduct investigations, how to document evidence, and how to build airtight cases. You made the mistake of assuming she was helpless when she's actually highly competent. The most devastating moment came when David played the recorded phone calls Patricia had obtained from my bank and insurance company. Hearing Garrett's voice describing my supposed memory problems and confusion, listening to him convince professionals that I needed protection from my own poor judgment, was damning evidence of their calculated deception. I want to be very clear about what's at stake here, David continued. These crimes carry potential sentences of up to 15 years in prison. The financial fraud alone is a Class B felony. Add in the elder abuse charges, and you're looking at substantial prison time. He paused to let that sink in before presenting their options. However, Mrs. Thornfield is willing to consider an alternative resolution: complete restitution of all stolen funds, formal apologies to every institution you lied to about her mental capacity, permanent restraining orders prohibiting any contact with her or her business, and your voluntary participation in a financial monitoring program for the next 5 years. And if we agree to this? Priscilla asked, her voice barely audible. No criminal charges will be filed, and this matter will be resolved civilly. But understand, this is a one-time offer. If you refuse these terms, or if you violate any aspect of the agreement, criminal prosecution will proceed immediately. David slid 2 copies of the settlement agreement across the table. You have exactly 1 week to decide. During that time, all your financial accounts will remain frozen, and will be monitoring for any attempt to hide assets or flee the jurisdiction. As they left the office with the settlement documents, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete control over my own situation. For the first time since this nightmare began, they were the ones scrambling to respond to my moves instead of the other way around. How do you think they'll respond? I asked David after they'd gone. They'll take the deal, he said confidently. They're young, they have careers to protect, and 18 months in minimum security prison isn't worth $23,000. Besides, we made it clear that refusing our offer means we throw everything we have at them. But more importantly than their decision was what this process had shown me about myself. I wasn't the vulnerable target they'd assumed I was. I was a woman who'd built something significant from nothing, and I had the skills, resources, and determination to protect what I'd created. They'd picked the wrong victim, and now they were about to pay the price for that miscalculation. The call came on Tuesday morning, 3 days before their deadline to accept our settlement offer. It was Garrett, and his voice carried a desperation I'd never heard before, not even when he was a child calling to confess some serious mischief. Mom, we need to talk. Not at the lawyer's office, not with all the formal paperwork. Just us, please. Something in his tone told me this wasn't another manipulation attempt. This was surrender. But I wasn't about to meet them alone, and I certainly wasn't going to my house where they might feel they had some kind of emotional advantage. Bellacorte, I said. Tonight at 6 p.m. after we close to regular customers, and David will be there as a witness. The choice of location was deliberate. I wanted them to sit in the restaurant they'd planned to steal from me, surrounded by the life's work they'd tried to take, while I delivered the final blow to their scheme. More importantly, I wanted them to see me in my element, not as the confused elderly woman they'd been manipulating, but as the successful businesswoman who'd built something they could never have created themselves. When they arrived that evening, Bellacorte had been cleared of customers, but the staff was still finishing their closing duties. Elena greeted them at the door with professional courtesy, but I could see the steel in her eyes. She knew exactly who they were and what they'd attempted. "Mrs. Thornfield is waiting for you in the private dining room," Elena said, leading them through the main restaurant. I'd specifically requested this route so they'd have to walk past the walls lined with awards, photos from community events, newspaper reviews, and 30 years of memories that told the story of what I'd accomplished. When they entered the private dining room, I was seated at the head of the table with David beside me, and all our documentation neatly arranged. But I'd also set the table with our finest china, crystal glasses, and a bottle of wine from my personal reserve, the same formality I used for the most important business meetings in Bellacorte's history. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the chairs across from me. "I believe you have something to tell me." Priscilla looked like she'd aged 5 years in the past week. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled. Her hands shook as she reached for her water glass, and she couldn't maintain eye contact. Garrett kept staring at the table, occasionally glancing around the room, as if seeing it for the first time. "We want to accept your settlement offer," Garrett said quietly. "All of it. Full restitution, the restraining orders, everything." "I'm listening," I replied, though I made no move to put them at ease. "But first," Priscilla said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to apologize. Not because the lawyers told me to, but because I need you to understand that I know what we did was wrong." For a moment I saw something that might have been genuine remorse in her eyes. I convinced myself that we were helping you, that you needed guidance and protection. But the truth is, I was jealous. "Jealous?" I asked, though I kept my voice neutral. "Jealous of this," she said, gesturing around the room. "Jealous that you'd built something so successful, so respected, so permanent. I'm 28 years old and I've never created anything that mattered. I've never built anything that lasted. I've never had an entire community respect me the way they respect you." She paused, wiping tears that seemed genuine. "I told myself that you were too old to appreciate what you had, that someone younger could manage it better. But the truth is, I wanted what you'd built because I was too lazy and too scared to build something myself." It was the first honest thing she'd said since I'd known her, and it caught me off guard. But I wasn't ready to forgive just because she'd finally admitted the truth. "And you, Garrett?" I asked, turning to my son. "What's your truth?" Garrett looked up, and I saw tears in his eyes that I knew were real. "My truth is that I've been a coward. I let Priscilla convince me that you were becoming a burden, because it was easier than admitting that I was ashamed." "Ashamed of what?" "Ashamed that I'm 32 years old and I've never accomplished anything close to what you've done. Ashamed that I had to move back in with my mother when my business failed. Ashamed that my wife was more ambitious and more successful than I was." He took a shaky breath. "It was easier to tear you down than to build myself up. Easier to convince myself that you were getting old and confused than to face the fact that you're still sharper and more capable than I'll probably ever be." The silence that followed was heavy with 32 years of motherhood, disappointment, and a love that had been weaponized against me. I felt David's hand briefly touch my arm, a reminder that I didn't have to respond with emotion, that I could stay focused on the business at hand. "Those are both very honest confessions," I said finally. "But honesty after being caught isn't the same as integrity. You didn't decide to tell me the truth. You decided to steal from me and got caught." I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked Maple Street, where people were walking past the restaurant they'd been coming to for 3 decades. "Do you see this place? Really see it?" They both nodded. though I wasn't sure they understood what I was asking. This restaurant exists because I was willing to risk everything I had on a vision that everyone told me was impossible. I was a divorced single mother with no restaurant experience, trying to create something sophisticated in a town that people said couldn't support it. I turned back to face them. I spent years working 18-hour days, learning every aspect of this business from the ground up. I made mistakes that cost me thousands of dollars. I dealt with difficult customers, unreliable suppliers, kitchen disasters, and staff emergencies. I earned every award on these walls and every dollar in my bank account. I walked back to the table and sat down, looking directly at both of them. What you tried to steal wasn't just money or property. You tried to steal 30 years of my life. You tried to take away my right to decide my own future. You tried to erase my accomplishments and replace them with your own ambitions. Priscilla was crying openly now, but I wasn't finished. But here's what you never understood. You can't steal someone's competence. You can't forge someone's experience. You can't manipulate someone's relationships with people who've known them for decades. I gestured toward the restaurant around us. Every person who works here knows exactly who I am and what I'm capable of. Every customer who's been coming here for years knows my character. Every supplier, every vendor, every professional I work with has seen me handle challenges and make decisions. I leaned forward, speaking directly to Garrett. You told people I was becoming confused and incompetent. But the moment those people were asked to provide specific examples, they couldn't do it. Because it wasn't true. Because 30 years of demonstrated competence doesn't disappear just because someone tells lies about it. David cleared his throat and slid the settlement documents across the table. These agreements include a provision that you'll both write formal letters to every institution you contacted with false information about Mrs. Thornfield's mental capacity. You'll retract your statements and acknowledge that they were inaccurate. We understand, Garrett said, reaching for a pen. Do you? I asked, stopping him. Because this isn't just about signing papers and writing checks. This is about understanding that you gambled your relationship with me on a scheme that was never going to work. I stood up one final time. You're going to sign those papers, and you're going to transfer every penny you stole back to my accounts. You're going to write those letters and restore my reputation with every institution you lied to, and then you're going to leave my life. Forever? Garrett asked, his voice breaking. That depends entirely on whether you can ever figure out how to be the man I raised you to be instead of the man she convinced you to become. As they signed the documents with shaking hands, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but sadness. I'd won completely. They would face consequences, I would be made whole financially, and my reputation would be restored. But the cost was losing my son, possibly forever. When they finished signing, David collected all the paperwork and handed them copies. You have 48 hours to complete the financial transfers and 7 days to send the retraction letters. Any failure to comply will result in immediate criminal prosecution. As they prepared to leave, Priscilla stopped at the door. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I hope someday I can build something half as meaningful as what you've created here. After they left, I sat alone in my restaurant, surrounded by the evidence of what I'd built and what I'd just protected. The justice was complete, but the victory felt hollow. Elena appeared in the doorway. Are you okay? I looked around the dining room one more time, at the life I'd built and successfully defended. I'm exactly where I belong, I said, and that's something they can never take away from me. 6 months later, I stood in the same private dining room at Bellacorte where I delivered justice to Garrett and Priscilla, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The table was set for 12 people, the walls were decorated with fresh flowers, and the air hummed with celebration rather than confrontation. Tonight marked the grand reopening of our renovated main dining room and the launch of the Rosalind Thornfield Culinary Scholarship, a program I'd established to help young people from Millbrook pursue careers in the restaurant industry. The settlement money had been returned in full within the required 48 hours, and every retraction letter had been sent exactly as specified. But rather than simply returning to my previous life, I'd used the experience to build something even stronger than what I'd had before. The attempted theft of my life's work had revealed not just my vulnerabilities, but also my resources, my resilience, and my capacity to turn adversity into opportunity. Mayor Thompson raised his glass for the third toast of the evening. To Rosalind Thornfield, who has shown this community what it means to turn challenges into triumphs. Bellacorte isn't just our finest restaurant. It's proof that vision, determination, and integrity will always prevail. The applause was warm and genuine, coming from the city council members, local business owners, and longtime customers who had rallied around me throughout the ordeal. Word had somehow gotten out about what Garrett and Priscilla had attempted, and rather than the scandal I'd feared, the revelation had generated an outpouring of support that reminded me why I'd chosen to build my life in this community. Elena approached with a satisfied smile. "The dining room is completely booked for the next 6 weeks," she reported, "and we've received 3 applications for the scholarship program already." The scholarship had been my way of transforming a painful experience into something positive. Using a portion of the recovered funds, I'd created a program that would send one deserving local student to culinary school each year, with guaranteed internship opportunities at Bellacorte upon graduation. It was my investment in the next generation of restaurant professionals, young people who would build their careers on genuine skill and hard work rather than manipulation and theft. "Mrs. Thornfield?" A young voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see Sarah Martinez, a 17-year-old who worked part-time as a hostess while finishing high school. "I wanted to thank you for the scholarship program. I've been saving for culinary school for 2 years, and this could make it possible." Looking at Sarah's eager face, I saw myself at that age, hungry for opportunity, willing to work for what I wanted, dreaming of creating something meaningful. "Tell me about your plans," I said, settling into a chair beside her. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah described her vision for opening a farm-to-table restaurant that would showcase local ingredients and support regional farmers. Her enthusiasm reminded me of my own early dreams, but her ideas were informed by modern sustainability practices and contemporary dining trends that I was still learning about. "You know what?" I said, pulling out my business card. "Call me next week. I think we should discuss an internship program that starts this summer, before you even get to culinary school." Sarah's face lit up with the kind of joy that reminded me why I'd gotten into the restaurant business in the first place. Not for the money or the recognition, but for the opportunity to create experiences that mattered to people. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself alone with David Chen, who had become not just my attorney, but a trusted friend throughout the ordeal. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling into a chair with a final glass of wine. I considered the question seriously. About protecting myself and my business? None. About losing Garrett? Every day. "Have you heard from him at all?" 3 weeks ago, he sent a letter. Not asking for anything. Not trying to justify what they did. Just acknowledging that he understood why I'd had to cut contact, and hoping that someday he might earn the chance to rebuild some kind of relationship. David nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like growth." "Maybe, but growth doesn't erase betrayal, and good intentions don't replace lost trust. If he's serious about changing, he'll have to prove it through years of different choices, not just words in a letter." The truth was more complicated than I wanted to admit. Part of me missed my son. Not the manipulative man he'd become, but the boy I'd raised. The young man who'd once helped me fold napkins and learn about wine pairings. But I'd also discovered something important about myself during this crisis. I was complete without him. My life, my work, my sense of purpose, none of it depended on family relationships that required me to diminish myself to maintain them. "I've been thinking about expanding," I told David, surprising myself with the admission. "Maybe opening a second location, or developing a catering division, or even writing a cookbook about building a restaurant business from scratch." "Really? After everything you've been through?" Because of everything I've been through, I corrected. This experience reminded me that I'm not just someone who happened to inherit or stumble into success. I'm someone who built something significant through skill, determination, and strategic thinking. And those abilities don't diminish with age. They get stronger with experience. David smiled. The scholarship program was just the beginning, wasn't it? The scholarship program is my investment in the future. But I've also been contacted by 3 other restaurant owners who want my advice on business development. Apparently, word has gotten out that I know how to protect and grow a restaurant business under challenging circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on me. Garrett and Priscilla's attempt to steal my life's work had actually enhanced my reputation in the industry. Their false claims about my declining mental capacity had been so thoroughly disproven that people now saw me as exceptionally sharp and capable for someone my age. I've also been asked to speak at the State Restaurant Association conference next month, I continued, about succession planning and protecting family businesses from internal threats. Will you do it? I already accepted. If my experience can help other business owners avoid what I went through, then something good will have come from all this pain. As we prepared to leave that evening, I walked through the dining room one final time, turning off lights and checking that everything was secure. This ritual had been part of my routine for 30 years, but tonight it felt different. I wasn't just securing a restaurant, I was protecting an empire that I'd successfully defended and was now ready to expand. The attempted theft of my life's work had forced me to take inventory of everything I'd accomplished, and the accounting had been impressive. I owned my building, my house, and substantial investments. I had a sterling reputation in my community and industry. I had loyal employees who respected my leadership, and customers who valued what I'd created. Most importantly, I had proven to myself and others that my capabilities were undiminished, and my judgment was sound. At 72, instead of being pushed toward irrelevance, I was entering what might be the most productive phase of my career. The skills that had built Bellacorte from nothing were the same skills that had protected it from those who wanted to steal it. And those skills were now positioned to create something even larger and more meaningful. As I locked the front door and walked to my car, I thought about the lesson I'd learned. When someone tries to diminish you, the best response isn't just to prove them wrong, it's to become more than you were before they tried to tear you down. Garrett and Priscilla had tried to steal my restaurant, my money, and my independence. Instead, they'd given me something much more valuable: absolute certainty about my own strength, clarity about my own worth, and freedom from the obligation to make myself smaller, to preserve relationships with people who couldn't appreciate my actual size. Some doors close permanently when trust is broken beyond repair. But when one door closes, a stronger person opens a window, climbs through it, and builds something better on the other side. That's exactly what I intended to do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.